Hello, I'm Vanessa Maria Graber, and this is the People Power Lunch Hour Show. On today's show, we are going to be featuring organizers who are working with immigrant communities to talk about the impact the pandemic and capitalism has had on their communities. Stay tuned for all that and more on this edition of the People Powered Lunch Hour Show on Philly Cam, TV, and radio. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hello, and welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. On today's show, we are going to be speaking with representatives from organizations here in Philadelphia that work with immigrant communities. And on today's show, we're going to be featuring some people from SEAMAAC, New Sanctuary Movement, Puentes de Salud, and Juntos here in Philadelphia. Here in Philly, there have been a lot of challenges in being able to serve the needs of various communities who are dealing with the loss of work, loss of income, social isolation, and having to homeschool their children. Today, we want to talk to members of these organizations because they've been working directly with immigrant communities, and they can speak to some of the challenges and needs that these communities have, and will tell you the ways in which you can support and be in solidarity with their organizations. First up, I'd like to introduce Thoai Nguyen. He is the CEO of SEAMAAC. And then I'm also joined by Alexandra Wolkoff of Puentes de Salud. Thank you both for joining us today on the People Power Lunch Hour Show.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks for having us.
To be here.
Thoai, let's start with you. Your organization serves primarily the Asian American community here in Philadelphia. Your organization has been, so to speak, on the front lines of this pandemic and has been doing incredible work with food distribution, with cleanups in the community, and also making sure that the elders are taken care of and not being isolated. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that your organization is doing and what some of the needs of the communities are in present day, now that we're 2 months into this stay-at-home order?
Right. So to clarify, SEAMAAC is not just an Asian organization. We were founded in 1984 to serve Southeast Asian refugees at that point. But after 36 years, we serve just about anyone, and we describe our serving community as people who are economically, socially, and politically marginalized. So as you can see, the pandemic has affected large swaths of whom we define as our constituents, primarily people of color, people who are working class poor, immigrants, refugees, elderly, women, all of whom are disproportionately affected by infection, deaths, and also disproportionately represented in people on the front line. When you look at who's on the front line, you see that it's primarily women, women of color, and in some ways we are seen as indispensable during these times, but also disposable. So I think we have to come to a decision. This country, the society has to come to a decision. Those in being indispensable and disposable cannot coexist.
Thank you for that clarification. And I think that's probably true of a lot of organizations who might have focused on one community, but as more and more of our neighborhoods become mixed and resources become limited, we start working together and serving lots of different kinds of people. Alexandra, I want to ask you the same question. Tell us about the community that Puentes de Salud serves, and what are some of the things that you've been dealing with as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, totally. Um, so Puentes serves a mainly undocumented Latino or Latinx immigrant community. About 15 years ago, our organization grew in collaboration with what was then a very young and nascent Mexican immigrant community here in the heart of Southeast Philadelphia along the 9th Street corridor. And over the years and up to present day, we're now serving folks from many different surrounding counties from all different parts of the city of Philadelphia, including different counties like Montgomery County, Delaware, Camden, around the area. Today, during the pandemic, we're actually serving folks from 78 different zip codes. We ran the data and we're really surprised to see just how big of a reach we're having right now with folks across Pennsylvania and even a little bit into New Jersey and into Delaware. So our work spans three main branches. From physical health, we have a health clinic that supports folks who are unable to access traditional forms of healthcare or health insurance, in addition to mental health support, wellness programming, and then education work. I'm in our education branch, and since COVID, that's transformed completely into food and emergency relief access for people, basic necessities, and a lot of case management. We've been doing an integrated needs assessment with folks here in Philadelphia and across the regions I just mentioned, and trying to connect folks with the resources we have here locally and building out those networks in other regions as well.
Thank you for that description. Now that we're 2 months into the stay-at-home order, and it looks like, things still aren't lifting, at least not in the immediate term, but that it would be a slow phase reopening, which means it's going to take some time for people to get back to work. And yet there's still so many people who are not receiving any economic resources. They're not getting stimulus checks. They're not getting unemployment. There's people who are not eligible for those resources. What do you think the financial impact has been for these communities? And what are the things that you are doing to address that financial impact? Thoai, I'll start with you.
Thanks for such a easy question. Our community has been devastated. And when I say our community, I think that I speak about the same community that Alex and Puente de Salud served. The communities that are poor working class, immigrant refugees, who have, prior to the COVID-19, have eked out a living from paycheck to paycheck. So as you can imagine, in the service industry or the hospitality industry, they have been either laid off, lost their jobs, and sometimes unable to collect unemployment. So the devastation has been tremendous. And I've recently learned that the rate of infection and deaths, while not officially counted or released, have been devastating within the immigrant refugee community, because I really do think that these are folks who are still um, trying to make a living even while there's a stay-at-home order, because without their 8 to 12 hour work day, they cannot put food on the table for their families. So they are going into the fields in Jersey or the farms in Pennsylvania, being crowded in 15.
I think his internet might have gotten delayed. Oh, there we are.
Sorry, I seem to have lost folks.
No, that's okay. Just a little delay. If you're just tuning in, this is the People Power Lunch Hour show, and we are speaking with Thoai Nguyen from SEAMAAC, who's been detailing the financial impact on some of the communities that his organization is serving. So you were talking about people having to choose between basically starving and, not being able to pay the rent and having to go out and work and risk their lives. Alexandra, have you heard some of the same from people in your community in terms of still having to go back to work or make these really tough choices?
Yes, definitely. I would underscore everything that Toy said just now, and in your initial answer, Toy, as well, that essential frontline workers and disposable can't exist in the same category, and that our country really needs to decide which one it is. The crisis is definitely having a disproportionate impact on immigrant communities as a whole, and on the community that we're serving here locally as well. Yes, I would say about 1,500 different families that we've spoken with since the crisis began. 95% of them have said that they've lost all or most of their income, as Toy was explaining. Most folks that we serve work in the service and in the restaurant industry, back of house positions, construction, or light housekeeping. And so, same for the folks we're working with. The devastation has been tremendous. Families are very concerned about how they'll be able to rebuild financially, assuming that everyone makes it out of this in good health, and their families, especially thinking about rent and the many months of back bills and payments that are accruing right now. But certainly we are seeing people return to work in different ways, as Toy said, in fields and factories, different kinds of packing plants, which of course is met with a lot of mixed emotions, both some happiness around being able to have a little bit of income again, but people are certainly reporting that many of their workplaces aren't taking all of the appropriate precautions, and there's a lot of fear around that about becoming infected and bringing that home to family members as well.
Yeah, I imagine that before the crisis that there was already unsafe work conditions and exploitative labor practices that people were fighting for and organizing around before COVID-19 even came to the United States. I think we've interviewed lots of organizers, with regards to labor. So that is still an issue, and continues to be, because I imagine those same employers who were not treating their workers well are not taking action or steps to keep their workers safe, to social distance, to provide personal protective equipment, and to provide testing as well, especially for these workers who have to be in close quarters.
I think that we live in a society, the U.S. society, still largely dominated by white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And as I've said earlier, that when I say that we have to make a decision, I think COVID-19, the pandemic, post-pandemic, we will be at a crossroad, and we all have a decision to make. Do we stand with the people? To blaze a new future, or do we continue to align with capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, and allow these things to continue to exist? You can see that Jeff Bezos from Amazon has made $30 billion in the last 8 weeks, right? We are all complicit in this, myself included. So every one of us will have to sacrifice some addiction, some fetishes, material fetish. Those of us who have the luxury to continue to get a paycheck and stay at home, do work at home. I'm continually asked about what they can do to help, or sometimes not at all. But I think that we need to understand that Amazon, Jeff Bezos, has 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 been one of the biggest perpetrator of treating people as disposable. All his workers, from the Amazon factories to Whole Foods, he could care less. If they want to quit, fine. There's going to be a ton of other people who are willing to take their place, and that's because you and I continue to order from Amazon, right? And Amazon is just one of the big examples, but I think there are many, many different little ones that we really need to stand with the workers and not allow these employers to exploit and hurt, the community members that have really basically built the foundation of this country and continue to uplift the foundation of this country. is unacceptable.
Yeah, and I would say the pandemic has shined a light even more so on the labor movement. What is the value of our labor, and how does our labor support this capitalist system? And I think that in the many conversations that we've been having across people from many different fields, there's one underlying thing that connects us all, which is the opportunity to reimagine our society, to reinvent the future, and to be able to take this as an opportunity to make significant reforms and changes into our way of life. And just as an example, many people working on environmental justice issues are seeing the one silver lining, which is the reduction in pollution by people staying home and not using their vehicles, which begs the question, do we have to significantly change our lifestyle in order to achieve lower carbon emissions? And the same question applies to how we treat our workers. This model is not sustainable. I want to talk about reimagining the future and what you think it could look like, and what steps people and our system of governance needs to take in order to treat people better, have a more sustainable way of life, and in order to, just value human lives and the work that we contribute to our society.
Yeah, and to underscore that as well, about the environment, and agree with you, Tori, again, that we all need to make a decision and change the ways that we're living. We can't continue in the same ways that we have been, both for the health of everyone around us, and the people who've become in these disposable positions, and the health and ability of our planet and us all really as a species to survive and come out of this. It really is a turning point and an opportunity, as you said, post-COVID or whatever, however we do come out of this, to seize upon, the different protections that have somewhat been put in place. There are still, many areas that where there's gaps and more left to be desired, but basic, healthcare affordance for everyone, basic protection for workers, really, as COVID exposes the gaps, and how, it's so easy. You push a button on your phone and, dinner shows up at your doorstep, or, as you said, a package from Amazon arrives, and really peeling back all the layers to make it very apparent the people and the lives, that go into the work, and the systems that make things like that so easy and so possible. But really recognizing the basic humanity that each person in that system, along that chain, has a family to go home to and to support, and that there are lives on the line here all the way throughout. And particularly for immigrant communities, folks who are undocumented, who are not afforded stimulus checks, or many other don't qualify for many other forms of government support, but without whom our country would not exist, our labor systems, and all of the conveniences that we're used to having. So it's a real point of reckoning for all workers in general, and particularly for folks in immigrant and undocumented communities who are generally not recognized as even having a presence here, other than the invisible labor value that they provide.
Yeah, and we're starting to see who's really holding the economy up, are, quote unquote, essential workers, who are often paid minimum wage, or, these gig economy workers who get paid next to nothing, after completing an Instacart transaction or Amazon delivery. And without these very people, we wouldn't be able to continue working from home and staying inside and doing all these things. I did want to pivot and ask a question about the global community, right? Because we're all connected to people from all over the world. My family is from Puerto Rico. The earthquakes have been continuing. We still had more this week. I've been concerned about hurricane season as a cyclone now lands on India and Bangladesh. What are some of the stories or concerns some of your community members have been talking about in terms of the global effect of the pandemic, and also not being able to travel, migrate, and move around, as so many countries have closed airports and restricted travel?
we serve a lot of our constituents are from many different nations, and we've been very fortunate when we have put the word out in the community for stay-at-home order, that people have respected that, and to really have made significant stride towards flattening the curve. Um, we have not heard a whole lot of stories about how this has affected people globally, aside from the relationships that people have to their home countries. Um, I'm just going to leave it at that and allow Alexandra to say a few things on that.
Yeah, in our case, similarly, we haven't heard too many reports about how it's affecting folks in other countries. But I would say the biggest impact is in terms of the wages and remittances that people here send back to family members that they're supporting in Mexico or Central American countries, et cetera. So, the disruption of work and people's financial stability and well-being is not only impacting folks here in Philadelphia or in the US, but also other family members that they support elsewhere. So that would be one of the biggest things that we've heard.
Yeah, and I've heard of people getting stranded or stuck in other countries when they went home to visit family, and then were not able to travel back to the United States due to the restrictions on travel and also closing airports, etc. So that has left people disconnected from their families as well. In the last several minutes that we have left in the program, I'd like to highlight any campaigns, events, or resources that the community should know about in terms of, serving the needs of the immigrant population here in Philadelphia. This is an opportunity to raise awareness about some of the work that you're doing. And again, as we move through the city's budget proposal and the state and federal budgeting process, there are many cuts that are going to be made to programs. And so people should be aware that these cuts have really big impacts on nonprofit organizations. And so highlighting the work that you do and how it helps people, I think, is an important connection to make when we see these budget cuts come down the line.
So for SEAMAAC, I think one of the biggest thing that's going to happen over the next 3 weeks is obviously the election, the primary election on June 2nd. SEAMAAC was a plaintiff in a lawsuit against this state to hopefully extend the mail-in ballot by 1 week. That was dismissed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court um, for many different reasons. But so we're now transitioning to more education. We have a few more days to get people who are interested to register and apply for absentee ballots. And then after that, we will be actually pushing, educating layered campaigns to do phone banking, text banking. Um, we can't do door knocking. We can't do in-person education or helping people fill out these forms, a lot of whom are limited English proficient residents, uh, uh, citizens of this country. Um, so I think that's one of the major things that is happening now, and we would hope that the friends and supporters of SEAMAAC will come out en masse to help with this. On June 2nd, we will be closing almost our entire hunger relief effort to pivot to making sure that those who are not eligible for or was not able to vote with their mail-in ballot are able to go to the polls to vote safely. So we will be providing PPE for everyone who's interested in voting, and we will also help them get to the consolidated polling places. So that's one big major thing. I think the other things that we really need to keep our eye on is the census. I think we need to get the word out. We need to get as close to 100% of count in the constituency that we serve, to make sure that we all count and because I think that provides us a measure of political power that we currently do not have.
Mhm.
And the last thing I would want to ask is that, all of us need to give up the last vestige of our patriarchy. That's myself, white supremacy, white privilege. We need to give that up, and we need to stand against capitalism and stand with the people. Um, there are very many small things that we can do. It does not need to be large gestures, but weaning yourself off from some of these capitalist addiction um, will have a tremendous impact on how we move towards the future.
Thank you so much for that. And I just want to let our viewers and listeners know that PhillyCam has some really great public service announcements, videos that you can share on social media regarding the census. We have it in many different languages. So I encourage people to go to our YouTube page at PhillyCam and share those videos. In the past, the census workers have been able to do a lot of public outreach and knock on doors. And so we're having to rely on community members to spread the word, show people how to do the census. It only takes 10 minutes, and you can get help and assistance in the language of your choice. And so there's many great organizations partnering to get people counted. And we also have a public service announcement about voting. So the deadline to request a mail-in ballot is May 26th, and you have to get your mail-in ballot in June 2nd. And I think it's an issue for another show, but we are essentially going from over 800 polling locations to under 200. It's a drastic change. So don't sleep on the census and don't sleep on the election. And again, we have resources on PhillyCam's page to support those outreach efforts. Alexandra, anything else that you want to highlight?
Similarly, for us at Puentes, we've been doing a huge outreach about the census so that people understand what it is, when to expect it, how to fill it out. There's quite a bit of fear and distrust, and also not understanding what it is. So similarly, a big campaign there so that as many people as possible can be counted, and that our communities can get the money that they're entitled to for themselves and for their kids. I would say as a city and a region, we also need to keep our eye on efforts that the city is making around food access and access to baby supplies, things like diapers and formula, as well as basic hygiene and cleaning products for folks. And keeping our eye on that situation, and continuing to demand and encourage that the city takes further leadership with that. Organizations like SEAMAAC, Us at Puentes, Juntos, and SEAMAAC, et cetera, different community groups are doing an incredible lift here, but definitely need to keep that systematic support coming from a top-down way and accountability there. And I would also encourage people to call on Governor Wolf to shut down the Burks Family Detention Center that's close by here. Kids and families there are, even before COVID, it was or continues to be an inhumane place for people to be kept. But especially now with the dangers of COVID, people need to be released immediately. So I'd encourage people to, call, write, tag Governor Wolf on social media, and continue to push for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. And, in regards to a lot of these companies that are exploiting their workers, you don't have to buy from them. You don't have to support from them. Simple Google searches will tell you everything you need to know about companies' labor practices. And I think it's important to know what the money is being used to do, right? And how our money and resources are being used. And so by simply withholding your money, that is one small way you can make an impact on these companies that don't value their workers and don't treat them well. And of course, that engagement with our elected officials to hold them accountable for the money that's being spent and the resources and how that's all allocated and serving the people. Thoai, Alexandra, I want to thank you both for joining us on the People Power Lunch Hour show. And I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, you just heard from Alexandra Wolkoff. She is the Director of Education of Puentes de Salud, a nonprofit organization that promotes health and wellness of Philadelphia's rapidly growing Latinx immigrant population through high-quality healthcare, innovative educational programs, and community funding. And you just heard from Thoai Nguyen. He is the CEO of SEAMAAC, an organization here in Philadelphia that supports and serves immigrants and refugees and other politically, socially, and economically marginalized communities as they seek to advance the condition of their lives in the United States. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll have more from representatives from immigrants organizations such as Juntos and the new sanctuary movement. You are watching Philly Cam TV and listening to WPPM Community Radio. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Do you feel lonely, stressed, sad, angry, or confused? Do you miss your friends and routines? Philly Hopeline is a free helpline sponsored by Uplift Center for Grieving Children and the School District of Philadelphia. It is staffed by master's level clinicians from Uplift and is open to all School District of Philadelphia students and families. Hope is only a call away. Call or text 833-PHL-HOPE, 833-745-4673.
Hello, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. On today's episode, we wanted to talk about the impact COVID-19 and capitalism has had on the immigrants community here in Philadelphia. In the first half hour, we heard from Thoai Nguyen from SEAMAAC and also Alexandra Wolkoff from Puente de Salud. And right now, we're going to feature two representatives from immigrants organizations here in Philadelphia. First up, Erika Guadalupe Núñez, the executive director of Juntos or Vamos Juntos. And then, hello, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. And right now, I also want to welcome Marguerite to the show. She is with the new sanctuary movement here in Philadelphia. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Well, hopefully you were able to listen to part of the conversation that happened in the first half hour. And I want to invite you both to give your own experiences in some of the work that you are doing with your own organizations. Erika, I want to start first with you. If you could talk about what are some of the things that you have observed and what are the challenges and needs that your community members have been articulating as you've been trying to serve them through your own work through Juntos?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'd like to touch on is that even before this pandemic started, Latino folks were already disproportionately impacted by systemic inequalities through systemic and deep-rooted economic inequalities, and most of them work in industries in Philadelphia that were hit hardest by the pandemic, so restaurants and hospitalities and other work like that. And if they're still working now, it's less hours, and as Thoai and Alexandra mentioned, in unsafe environments. And I think some of the biggest concerns that we've been seeing is that while COVID doesn't discriminate, our government does. Undocumented people are not eligible for a lot of the federal relief programs, the stimulus package, for example, and they have been
Oh, I think we lost her audio really quickly. While we're getting her back, I just want to talk a little bit about Juntos. Their mission statement is to lead, organize, and collaborate. They are a community-led Latinx immigrant organization in South Philly, fighting for human rights as workers, parents, youth, and immigrants. They believe every human being has the right to a quality education and the freedom to live with dignity, regardless of immigration status. All right, Erika. Okay. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Great, thank you. And just quickly to wrap up, it's sort of, our community, as was mentioned earlier, immigrant communities are at the front lines of the pandemic as essential workers. And while they're at the front of the lines as immigrants and also undocumented immigrants, they don't have the same protections, benefits, and there's literally no social safety net for them. And because of that, we're just seeing, like, because of the combination of conditions before the pandemic and those now, it's really exacerbated the precarious situation our community is in. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people that are actually getting infected at a higher rate, and they're also, for example, if they're in detention, they're also at a vulnerable risk there as well.
Thank you for that. Marguerite, how do you say your last name?
Kise.
Kise. Okay, Marguerite Kise from New Sanctuary Movement. Thank you for joining us. New Sanctuary Movement of Philadelphia builds community across faith, ethnicity, and class in their work to end injustices against immigrants, regardless of immigration status, express radical welcome for all, and ensure that the values of dignity, justice, and hospitality are lived out in practice and upheld in policy. Tell us a little bit about your experience. I'm sure it's been similar to some of the other guests on the show, but let us know, what are some of the concerns and challenges?
Yeah, I think I want to kind of just hitchhike on the back of what everyone else has said about the ways that this pandemic has really just exacerbated the economic and social burdens that immigrants are faced. And I think one thing that I want to add is a particular exacerbation of the isolation that a lot of immigrants face, especially recent immigrants. And I think that is something unique about New Sanctuary Movement because we have such an expansive accompaniment program. We have relationships with hundreds of recent immigrants who are less likely to own a computer, less likely to be connected to social services, less likely to be ingrained in community. And I will add that one of my coworkers is constantly on the phone, particularly with a lot of people who are single parents, recent immigrants with young kids who have re-entered the country. So now re-entry is a criminal charge, as a lot of folks know. And that particular experience comes with its own layers and dynamics of hardship. And yeah, I will add that rent and food have been the biggest problems we're hearing. And with food, it's not just access to food, it's also access to culturally appropriate food. And we are hearing that also from our Indonesian members, our Afro-Caribbean members, and our members from the African diaspora, that one of my coworkers called it, people are getting kids food, school food. So a lot of cookies, canned corn, not food that makes people feel nourished and that they're used to. And that is seen as a big challenge. And then the last thing I'll add about rent is we had a wonderful workshop with incredible organizers from TURN as well as Puentes de Salud about a month ago now. And we took questions in the community, and overwhelmingly the question we got was, I am a tenant, I am a sub-renter, I only rent through word of mouth, and my landlord is telling me they're going to kick me out. And I think that speaks to a few different challenges, and one of the biggest ones is the lack of knowledge about people's rights, and that everybody, no matter what kind of contract, even an oral contract, is valid, and that all tenants have rights. And it's just a matter of getting that information to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a real concern for when these courts open back up again and what will happen to people when eviction proceedings are allowed to proceed. And there still has not been any state or federal resources dedicated to rent assistance. Last week, there was some assistance available through the city, but it was a very short window. It was about 6 days where people could apply, and they had to have a lot of documentation in order to get that assistance. And if you didn't have a lease, then you were not eligible to get that assistance, which means a lot of people who are subletting and who maybe don't have a lease were not able to get that support. I wanted to ask a general question about information because at first it was very difficult to get information in Spanish and in other languages. And there was an effort from a lot of Latinx nonprofit leaders to push the city to provide that public health information. How is the situation now? Is it still hard to get that information to these communities? And have you been finding yourselves playing a really huge role in translating and interpreting for people?
I can go ahead first.
Sure.
So I think definitely when the pandemic started, Juntos' largest role was to get information out quickly in an accessible manner to community members. I think it's not just so much the language in which information is presented, it's also the format in that it's presented. So what we saw was that a lot of information was on clunky websites that community members mostly review information on their cell phone. So what we shifted to doing was, condensing information, pulling out the key points, and making simple graphics to make sure that that would be accessible. And I think another large role that Juntos and all the other organizations on this call is sort of vetting the information and sort of reassuring community members that it's something that they can have access to and that there's no repercussions. I think because of the federal administration in which we're under has done a lot in the last few years so that the immigrant and specifically the undocumented population don't feel comfortable accessing any kind of aid or public relief because they're concerned about being marked as a public charge. And that's something that would, affect them negatively in the future if they were to apply for any form of status.
Yes, I have heard that from others as well. And also for people that are married to immigrants who are also being denied assistance, even though their spouse might have legal status. And Marguerite, have you, as someone involved in communications work, having to work just as hard in order to get information to your community members?
Yeah, I would second everything that Erika said. NSM, at the beginning of the pandemic, immediately hired 5 community members to do a large phone banking project for us. And through over 500 calls, 65% of the respondents said that there was someone in their house who could not read or write. And so I think that again calls attention to exactly what Erika said of communication is so much more than just language. It is about form and connection. And so exactly, so like things need to be displayed in a visual manner. And also, just because people see something doesn't mean they believe it, that like it really does make a difference when you get a call and you have a discussion with somebody about your access and your right to access services. So all that follow-up is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about education as well. We did an episode for another show that was entirely focused on education. And one of the things was mentioned that is the challenge for so many parents to have to homeschool. Even for English-speaking Americans who are professionals, doing Common Core math has been really difficult. So I imagine that for older adults, maybe grandparents taking care of their children, it's been difficult for people who are not English speakers. And also, as you mentioned, for people that don't have high literacy rates. Have you been hearing from your community members that they've been really struggling with homeschooling?
We have been, especially folks who don't have personal experience attending secondary school. And not only do they not know how to speak English, but they're not familiar with how school might organize information. But I think even beyond that, what we're hearing is mostly just exhaustion from parents of having to not only emotionally deal with supporting their family, but also having to do childcare all the time. And that is just making everything harder.
Yeah.
And Erika, have you been hearing some of the same?
Yeah, similar. I think our folks are exhausted, right? Our parents are exhausted, not only because of what's happening within their home, but what's coming from the outside. And I think one thing that I'd like to touch on is that there's a massive tech divide, I think, within our community. I think there's a lack of access to internet. And I know that Puentes de Salud has been doing a lot of work on this and making sure that their members are connected to internet so that their children are able to log into their classes. And I think that's a real issue, not just for the immigrant community here in Philadelphia, but other low income and other underserved communities in the city, that a lot of them don't have strong connection to the access to internet. And I think one of the more disturbing things I saw in the few weeks that when the pandemic started is that the district was suggesting folks connect to internet from parking lots. And that's just not a long-term solution, considering that we might be in this pandemic for the next year or so. And I think one thing that I heard is that there was a lot of info coming to folks' homes depending on the school that they went to, just because there's a lack of consistency, I think, across the city. And then to go back to that tech idea, I think that the communities that we serve, our parents aren't as able to get their children connected to the internet. They're not as equipped to make sure that the technology is working. And I think what that impact that has, it has it on the child the most. They're not able to log into their classes. And I think I saw that like nearly half of students last week did not connect to their remote classes online. And that's a problem, because we're going to be in this pandemic for a long time. And there's no real approach, I think, to solve some of these issues.
Yeah, and just also it's hard to work from home when you live with a bunch of people and you don't have a quiet space to attend classes, or if you're a teacher teaching classes. And so a lot of families are multi-family households, and it can be difficult for children and teenagers to be able to focus on their schoolwork, even when they do have access. And we know that Comcast has been offering internet essentials, but we've heard from so many people that it's been very difficult to gain access to those programs. One of the things I wanted to highlight was the May Day Worker Solidarity Caravan that happened on May 1st. And we spoke with one of the organizers on one of our other programs. And it was a caravan that drove around the city, stopping at many different places, including City Hall, including the ICE Detention Center. Can you talk about your participation in that action and what you were trying to do in terms of raising awareness for our workers?
I can start, and Erika, you can jump in as you see needed. So both Erika and I were pretty deeply involved in that. And I think that was a beautiful demonstration about the way that a workers framework enables us to see how we need to transform from this moment of crisis with everybody. And that everybody is a worker, and everybody's labor is valuable, even if they're not working right now. And particularly Erika and I want to mention that we have been working with this really incredible emergent collective of immigrant organizations across the city that came together right when the pandemic started, and have since formed this beautiful kind of like synergetic space in which we are uniting all of our resources and knowledge. And so that collective was really involved in this caravan and used it as a space to highlight certain demands that specifically undocumented workers need. And yeah, I'll let Erika tag on from there.
Yeah, and I think the running theme of the day for me that really struck me was the idea that we were doing a people first. We were demanding a people first response to this pandemic, and sort of touching on our previous conversation about education. So, for example, Philadelphia is one of the few cities that doesn't ask for pilots from the large nonprofits in our city. So payments in lieu of taxes. So schools like Penn, for example, don't pay taxes. And I think the estimated number is around 30 million or so. And that is a shocking number when you think about how our school district is going to be in debt over the next 5 years. So you're thinking about how these companies aren't being pushed to sort of invest in the communities that they're in, and our people are bearing the brunt of that. And yeah, I think, just to sort of outline some of the demands, we had different sections, and it was free our people, care for our people, house our people. Yeah. And the great thing about that is that each, it was informed by a very number of organizations that were grassroots organizations, direct service organizations, and I think it was like a very well-informed, there's a lot of different sides to it that spoke to everyone, the different communities that we all served.
Yeah, and we have footage for that available on our website, wppm.news. And if you go to our WPPM Facebook page, we have an interview live from the caravan with Ted Kelly of Workers World, and featured Blanca Pacheco, who was speaking on the back of a pickup truck, driving around Philly. One of the things I thought was great is that there was these recordings that were being shared, I believe from either people in jail or people in detention, but they were talking about some of the conditions that they were experiencing. And I thought that was an important voice to share, and it was a creative way to be able, and I think they just connected the phone to the mic and the PA system and played those voices. What have you been hearing in terms of people in detention? Of course, in the earlier segment, the closure of the Berks Detention Center was mentioned as an action people can take and talk to Governor Wolf about. There's still a crisis in our detention centers that I think is maybe not being highlighted as much due to the pandemic coverage. Is there anything that you want to say or highlight about that? Because still so many people, families are still being separated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll start, and then Erika, I know you have wonderful things to say about this. What is happening in our detention centers is atrocious. It is guaranteed that if folks are staying in detention centers and in confined spaces, they will be infected. And what we have seen a lot of is that folks who are not infected are being transported to other centers. So NSM works largely with the two facilities in Pennsylvania, which are York and Pike detention centers. And we'll be working with somebody and the next day learn that they have been transported to Texas in order to remove them from a contaminated space. But that move is not only psychologically harmful and scary for the person, but also makes it harder to access them, makes it harder for their family to communicate with them, and generally makes their case confusing. I will also add that NSM does a lot of work with folks applying for asylum, and right now we cannot get a hold of any lawyer that has any openings for new cases. And so we see just a bottlenecking at every point of the system. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Erika, did you want to share some thoughts on that same topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Juntos, along with other organizations, we receive a lot of calls from folks who have a loved one in detention. And when it's been it's a limited amount of contact they've had with their family members on the inside. And I think that's a strategic move by ICE, is to make sure that those that are being detained aren't able to relay out information as quickly. But from what we have heard is that there isn't proper PPE for guards moving between different pods, that folks are being held in mass groups, and there's no way for you to social distance, of course, when you're detained. And recently we read that out of the small percentage of people that are being tested, I think it was out of a pocket of like 2,000 people that were tested, nearly 60% of those tested positive for COVID. And those are just the cases that we know about. And I think the big thought that I have around this is that I think one thing that needs to happen is ICE as a business, as a company, as a segment as a branch of the government, it needs to be deemed non-essential right now. I think detentions and deportations is actually a public health issue. To touch a little bit about what Marguerite said, a lot of those folks who were moved to Texas from our area in the US, they were moved to sort of limit infection. But what we heard is that a grand majority of them actually tested positive when they arrived in Texas. And considering those that are being deported, we've heard reports of planes arriving in Guatemala, in Haiti, and nearly all of those who've landed testing positive for COVID. So when you think about that, that's like a form. I described it as biological warfare on May 1st because I was just so upset, but I don't think that's far from the truth. I think, the US is sending these people back to countries that have limited amount of ventilators and are also dealing with the ramifications of living, under the imperialist thumb of the US. And to touch on just one last thing, once more, is that Marguerite mentioned the inability to get a lawyer. So right now, the PIFUP, which is a program that's a universal representation program, and it was cut from the city budget. And the PIFUP stands for the Pennsylvania Immigrant Family Unity Project, and that was completely cut. It's like $300,000 that is budgeted for it, and that is the only free representation program in the city for folks who are in detention. And if you're in detention right now in the US, you do not have a right for representation. And so what that means is that your family has to find money to pay for a lawyer. And how is a family who is disproportionately impacted by this pandemic able to put together funds for their loved one in detention? And that's something that I'd like to mention, that folks who are listening, if you're able to call your council people and push for PIFUP to be reinstated in the budget.
Thank you so much for that detailed description of everything that's going on. It's really important to highlight what's happening in these communities so that they're not invisible, their voices are elevated. And I want to thank you for being on the show and for all the work that the two of you and all of your comrades have been doing. If you're just tuning in, this is the People Power Lunch Hour show. I've been speaking with Erika Guadalupe Núñez. She is the executive director of Juntos. And I've also been speaking with Marguerite Kise, the development and communications coordinator of the new sanctuary movement. That's going to do it for this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour show. If you'd like to see this episode and all of our episodes of the People Power Lunch Hour show, you can visit our website at phillycam.org to learn more about People Powered Media. You can also follow us on social media at PhillyCam and at WPPM FM. And you can check out our WPPM news blog at WPPM.news. I want to thank Thoai Nguyen from SEAMAAC, Erika Núñez from Juntos, Marguerite Kise from New Sanctuary Movement, and Alexandra Wolkoff from Puentes de Salud for joining us on the show. Make sure you register to vote and also get counted in the census. Thanks so much for watching and listening.